My name was something once. I remember that much. They found me in sub-level 93 of the Space Hulk Testament of Ruin, 17 decks below where breathable atmosphere should have been possible. I was crouched in a ventilation shaft barely wide enough for a human child, my body compressed into angles that would have shattered unaugmented bones. The recovery team's auspex registered my life signs as aberrant Xenos threat before their squad leader recognized the corroded chapter symbol still fused to what remained of my chest plate. Blood Angels. Once. I attacked them, of course. 2 centuries of hunting genestealers in absolute darkness had turned ambush into autonomic reflex. I killed 3 Ultramarines before their chaplain spoke the litany of reawakening. And something in those formal words I'd been conditioned to respond to through decades of hypno-indoctrination, made me stop with my teeth buried in the 4th Marine's gorget seal. They told me later I'd been screaming the entire time. Not words, just sound. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the 200 years between the battle brother I was and the feral thing they dragged from the dark. Let me tell you what happens when duty becomes a curse, and when the enhanced lifespan they claimed was the Emperor's gift. They always called it a gift, those lying priests. Transforms into something worse than any death. My name was Davos Sanctore. I was 47 standard years old, and I still believed then in all the lies they'd programmed into me. 23 days before we crashed into the Testament of Ruin, I stood in the strategium of the strike cruiser Crimson Oath and listened to Captain Raphael outline our mission with the same ceremonial formality that preceded every deployment. "The Emperor protects brothers," he intoned, his voice carrying the weight of 10 centuries of service. "And we are his instruments." I was young enough then to believe both statements were true. Young in the way only Space Marines measure youth. 47 years of life, 35 since my gene seed implantation, and still considered barely more than a scout. But I'd survived the transformation. Survived the visions that came with Sanguinius's gene legacy. Survived long enough to lead my own scout squad. That felt like achievement, like purpose. The strategium smelled of sacred oils and old parchment. The tech priests had recently performed their weekly appeasement rituals on the ship's cogitator banks. I watched them chant in binary and anoint the machines with scented lubricants, and I believed, as I'd been trained to believe, that the machine spirits responded to devotion. It would be decades before I understood those spirits were nothing more than degraded programming, and the rituals were maintenance procedures wrapped in theological theater to give the Mechanicus control over knowledge that should have been shared. Captain Raphael gestured to the hololith display, where a massive spatial anomaly rotated in sickly green wireframe, the Space Hulk Testament of Ruin. 12 kilometers of fused warp wreckage, 53 identifiable ship hulls compressed and melted together by forces that violated physics even as I'd been taught to understand it. Intelligence suggests a pre-heresy strike cruiser is embedded in Section 7 Gamma, Raphael continued. If recoverable, its data cores could contain navigational charts from before the Noctis Eterna. The Administratum has designated this a Priority Alpha retrieval. I studied the wireframe, my augmented eyes picking out the structural weaknesses and viable entry vectors with the trained precision of 3 decades hunting enemies through urban ruins and death-world jungles. This was what I did, what I was built for. Squad Sanctuary will insert here. Raphael indicated a corroded docking structure. Retrieve the cores, extract at designated coordinates, 48 hours maximum deployment. He made it sound simple. They always did. For the Emperor and Sanguinius, Raphael concluded, making the sign of the Aquila across his chest plate. For the Emperor and Sanguinius, we responded in unison, our voices blending into a single affirmation of loyalty. The words came automatically, beaten into us through years of hypno-conditioning and ritual repetition. I spoke them with genuine conviction then, believing I served something divine rather than understanding I was a tool created by one tyrant to fight the tools of other tyrants. The priests had done their work well. The indoctrination had taken root so deep I couldn't distinguish programming from faith. My squad consisted of 4 others, each one hand-picked over years of joint operations. Brother Cortez, 51 years old, his face marked by acid burns from a Terranid warrior he'd killed with his combat knife when his bolter jammed. He had a habit of humming imperial hymns during equipment checks, his voice surprisingly melodic for someone who could crush a human skull one-handed. He'd been raised in a hive-world schola progenium, where they'd started the conditioning before he could walk. By the time the Blood Angels recruited him, he already believed his life belonged to powers he called divine. Brother Matthias, 49 years, recruited from the same rad-waste tribes as me. We'd tracked sandworms together as children before the chapter claimed us. He still remembered the old ways, the survival techniques our fathers taught us, knowledge that had nothing to do with imperial liturgies. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, he'd trace patterns in dust the way our tribe elders had, and I'd see the shadow of the free human he might have been before the conditioning began. Brother Vicente, 44 years, the squad's tech specialist. He'd been trained by the tech marines, learned their prayers and rituals, and believed with absolute certainty that machines possessed spirits that could be pleased or angered. I watched him perform his sacred maintenance with religious devotion, never questioning why the machine spirit's moods perfectly correlated with mechanical stress and component degradation. Brother Constantine, youngest at 39 years, still eager to prove himself worthy of promotion to the battle companies. He quoted the Imperial Creed constantly, could recite entire passages of the Codex Astartes from memory, and believed every word of the propaganda we'd been fed. He was what the system wanted us all to become, a perfect weapon that never questioned its purpose. These were my brothers. Not through blood, but through shared conditioning and manufactured loyalty. I would have died for any of them without hesitation, not because I chose that bond, but because I'd been programmed to value it above my own existence. We prepared our gear in the Crimson Oath's armory, the familiar rituals providing comfort through repetition. I field-stripped my bolter for the 47th time that month, my hands moving through the sequence without conscious thought, while Cortez hummed the Hymn of the Just Blade, and Vicente murmured prayers to weapons that possessed no spirits to hear them. Clean insertion, rapid extraction, I told my squad, repeating the briefing parameters. We've done this 100 times. Constantine grinned, his gene-enhanced features sharp in the armory's harsh lighting. The Emperor protects, Sergeant. We'll be back before the chaplains finish evening prayers. I nodded, accepting his words as the encouragement they were meant to be, never recognizing them as the echo of propaganda designed to make us willing to die for bureaucrats we'd never met, serving systems that ground humans into components with the same efficiency as a manufactorum grinding ore. The night before deployment, I stood in my quarters during the ship's artificial night cycle and allowed myself to think about my father. This was dangerous. Attachments to our pre-recruitment lives were discouraged, seen as distractions from duty, but the memory was strong that night, vivid in ways it hadn't been in years. I was 7 years old, standing on a dune of red ash while toxic winds screamed across the rad wastes of Baal Secundus. My father knelt beside me, his radiation-scarred hands drawing patterns in the dust. "Watch the wind, Davos," he said, his voice rough from breathing air that should have killed him years ago. "Every creature leaves a trace. You just have to know how to read it." He drew lines showing how a sandworm's passage disturbed the ash differently from wind alone, how the heat signature of buried prey could be detected in the cooling patterns after sunset. This was survival knowledge earned through generations of humans living on a world that actively tried to kill them. No prayers, no divine protection. Just observation, adaptation, and the knowledge passed from father to son. "Will you teach me to hunt like you?" I asked. He smiled, and there was sadness in it that I only understood later. "I'll teach you what I can, boy, but the angels will come for you soon. Your eyes have started to change." The amber tint in my irises, early manifestation of genetic compatibility with the blood angel's gene seed. I was being called to a higher purpose, according to the chapter's recruitment rhetoric. My father knew it meant he'd lose his son to a system that would reshape me into something that barely remembered him. 3 months later, the recruiters came. They made it sound like an honor, like I was chosen by something divine rather than selected by genetic screening for compatibility with engineered organs. My father never tried to hide me or argue. "You didn't refuse the Space Marines. You just watched them take your children and told yourself it was glorious, because the alternative was admitting you'd fed your son to a machine that would consume everything he was and replace it with programming." The last thing he said to me, "Remember how to read the wind, Davos. Remember you are human first." I forgot that advice for decades. The conditioning buried it under layers of catechisms and battle cant. But standing in my quarters aboard the Crimson Oath, the night before everything ended, I remembered my father's hands in the red dust and realized I couldn't quite recall his face anymore. The gene seed therapies and hypno-conditioning hadn't just enhanced my body. They'd eaten my memories, replacing personal history with imperial liturgies and chapter doctrine. This was intentional. Emotional attachments made soldiers question orders. Better to fill their heads with propaganda and call it sacred truth. I should have been horrified by that realization. Instead, I felt only mild regret and moved on to final equipment checks. The conditioning was that thorough. The Thunderhawk's engines screamed as we descended toward the testament of Ruin's twisted superstructure, the pilot fighting atmospheric turbulence that had no business existing in the vacuum of space. But space hulks generated their own microenvironments, pockets of inexplicable physics where warp contamination had rewritten natural law. Through the viewport, the Hulk looked like a wound in reality, Corroded metal and alien architecture fused into something that hurt to look at directly. 17 different ship designs compressed and melted together, their original purposes lost in the amalgamation. I counted at least 5 different human vessel classifications, 2 probable Eldar components, and something massive and organic that might have been Tyrannid in origin. 30 seconds to insertion. The pilot's voice crackled through the Vox. Auspex is reading unstable atmosphere and electromagnetic interference. Vox range will be limited inside. Standard complications. Nothing we hadn't trained for. The Thunderhawk's mag clamps engaged with a metallic shriek that vibrated through the deck plating. The assault ramp dropped, and we moved into the hulk with practiced efficiency, our movements coordinated through decades of joint operations. The smell hit me first, a combination of frozen decay and something chemical I couldn't identify. The air was barely breathable, thin and stale, but within tolerances for space marine physiology. Our armor's rebreathers engaged automatically, filtering out toxins while our enhanced lungs adapted to the reduced oxygen. The entry corridor was massive, clearly designed for something larger than human scale. The walls were covered in a crystalline frost that reflected our Auspex beams in fragmented patterns. Everything was silent except for our footsteps and the quiet hum of active armor systems. "Vox check," I ordered. 4 acknowledgements came through clearly. "All systems operational. Proceed to objective. Standard formation." We moved deeper into the hulk, following the path Captain Raphael's strategic analysis had designated optimal. The corridors twisted at angles that violated standard ship architecture, the result of multiple vessels compressed together by forces that cared nothing for original design specifications. We found the bodies in Hour 3. Not fresh corpses. These had been dead for centuries, maybe longer. 37 human remains scattered across a chamber that had once been somebody's cargo bay. Their equipment was archaic, pre-heresy pattern according to Vicente's immediate analysis, and their armor bore chapter markings I didn't recognize. "Imperial fists," Vicente said, running his Auspex over one intact helmet. "But this design hasn't been standard issue for 8,000 years. 8,000 years. This hulk had been drifting through the warp since before the Imperium's current form had solidified, collecting debris and dead ships like a corpse collecting maggots. The Imperial fists had died violently. Massive trauma to armor and flesh, the kind of damage caused by claws designed to pierce ceramite. I'd seen similar wounds before, on battlefields where the Imperium fought Xenos threats that specialized in close-quarters butchery. "Genestealers," Matthias said quietly, reaching the same conclusion. "Genestealers. Xenos horrors that infested space hulks like parasites, their claws capable of tearing through power armor, their cunning making them perfect ambush predators. And if there had been Genestealers here 8,000 years ago, there were certainly Genestealers here now. The creatures were patient, could survive in dormancy for millennia, and bred with horrifying efficiency when prey presented itself. "Stay sharp," I ordered, unnecessary but ritualistic. "Weapons hot." We moved forward, but the atmosphere had changed. The mission had shifted from recovery operation to combat deployment, and every shadow became a potential threat. The hulk's architecture grew more chaotic the deeper we penetrated. Corridors ended in walls that shouldn't exist. Gravity flickered between standard and microgravity without pattern, and the temperature dropped steadily until frost formed on our armor's exterior plating. We found the strike cruiser's remains in Hour 7. The pre-heresy vessel Captain Raphael had sent us to retrieve data from. It was embedded in the hulk's superstructure like an insect trapped in amber, its hull breached in 17 places, its interior exposed to vacuum. And it was full of genestealers. I saw them moving through the wreckage, massive four-armed silhouettes with carapaces that reflected our auspex beams in purple-black chitin. At least 20 visible, probably more hidden in the shadows. "Pull back," I ordered immediately. "This is beyond our mission parameters. We need Terminator support." We retreated in controlled stages, covering each other's movement with textbook precision. The genestealers followed but didn't attack, content to herd us away from their nest rather than engaging directly. Professional, controlled, we were doing everything correctly. Then the floor collapsed beneath Constantine, and everything went wrong. The deck plating simply ceased to exist beneath Constantine's feet, ancient metal finally surrendering to millennia of corrosion. He dropped with a shout of surprise, his hands scrambling for purchase on edges that crumbled at his touch. I moved without thinking, my sergeant's training overriding tactical sense. I lunged forward, caught his wrist with one hand while mag-locking my boots to what I hoped was stable flooring. It wasn't. The entire section gave way, and suddenly all 5 of us were falling through darkness, plunging down through at least 7 decks of compromised superstructure. We hit outcroppings and support beams, the impacts ringing against our armor like cathedral bells, each collision changing our trajectory in unpredictable directions. I lost sight of my squad in the darkness, lost sense of up or down. The fall seemed to last forever and no time at all. I hit something solid with enough force to crack my helmet's left lens and trigger my armor's auto-sealant systems. Pain flared through my left side. Ribs cracked despite ceramite protection and gene-enhanced durability. My helmet display flickered, showing compromised systems and atmosphere warnings. For several seconds, I just lay there, my augmented physiology already beginning repairs, while my stunned consciousness tried to process what had happened. Slowly, training reasserted itself. I ran through the post-impact checklist they had drilled into us. Breathing, mobility, armor integrity, weapon status, tactical awareness. Breathing, functional, though each inhalation sent spikes of pain through my damaged ribs. Mobility, 4 limbs responding, though my left leg felt wrong in ways my medical training couldn't immediately diagnose. Armor integrity, compromised but holding. Helmet damage was cosmetic except for the cracked lens. Atmosphere read as barely tolerable but breathable. Weapon status, bolter intact, combat knife secured, 3 frag grenades remaining. Tactical awareness, absolutely none. I was in complete darkness in an unknown section of the hulk with no idea where my squad had fallen. "Vox check," I said, my voice sounding strange through my damaged helmet speakers. "All units report status." Static answered me, broken by brief bursts of something that might have been voices but were too distorted to pass. The electromagnetic interference Vicente had mentioned was worse down here, wherever here was. I activated my armor's omni-lamp, and cold white light pierced the darkness. I was in some kind of vast chamber, easily 100 meters across, the walls covered in the same crystalline frost I'd seen in the entry corridors. Debris littered the floor, shattered machinery, structural components, and what looked like frozen organic matter whose origin I didn't want to consider too carefully. And in the distance, barely visible in my lamp's reach, I saw movement. I found Cortez first, trapped under a support beam that had collapsed across his legs. He was conscious but immobilized, his armor's power plant flickering in ways that suggested critical damage to the energy distribution systems. "Sergeant," he said when my lamp found him, relief obvious even through his helmet's vox distortion. "Thought you'd died in the fall." "Not yet," I replied, moving to assess his situation. The beam was massive, at least 3 tons of corroded metal. Even with power armor and gene-enhanced strength, I couldn't lift it alone. I spent 40 minutes carefully cutting through the beam with my combat knife's power field, while Cortez recited prayers to the Emperor and Sanguinius. They'd conditioned him to seek comfort in liturgies during crisis, a psychological crutch to prevent panic. I let him pray, knowing the words changed nothing but understanding his need to speak them. When I finally freed him, his legs were crushed badly enough that even Space Marine healing would take weeks to repair fully. He could walk, but not fight effectively. We found Matthias 3 hours later, unconscious but alive, his helmet cracked open and exposing his face to the Hulk's toxic atmosphere. I sealed the breach with emergency repair resin while his enhanced immune system fought off whatever contamination he'd breathed. Vicente and Constantine remained missing. We searched for 12 hours, calling their names over compromised Vox channels, following debris trails and impact patterns. We found Vicente's bolter, the weapon twisted and useless. We found Constantine's left pauldron still smoking from some kind of energy weapon discharge. But we didn't find them. On hour 19 after the fall, exhausted and running on stimulants from our armor's medical systems, we made the tactical decision to establish a defensive position and wait for rescue. The chapter would send retrieval teams. We just had to survive until they arrived. That was the lie we told ourselves, the false hope we clung to because accepting the truth was unthinkable. We'd fallen into a section of the Hulk, so deep and so isolated that no rescue would ever find us. The Vox interference made communication impossible beyond 50 meters. Our auspex couldn't penetrate the walls to map an escape route. And somewhere in the darkness, Genestealers were hunting. We built our fortification in a chamber whose original purpose we couldn't determine, using debris to create choke points and overlapping fields of fire. We rationed our remaining ammunition. I had 47 bolter rounds remaining. Cortez had 63. Matthias's bolter had been destroyed in the fall, leaving him with only his combat knife. On hour 24, we heard the first screaming. It came through the Vox, brief and terrible. Vicente's voice, recognizable even through static, speaking words in a language I didn't know before cutting off mid-syllable. Then Constantine, younger and more frightened, calling for help that would never come. Then silence. "They're alive," Cortez said, starting to rise. "We have to—" "That wasn't alive," I interrupted, my voice harder than necessary. "That was bait. The Genestealers are trying to draw us out." Matthias, awake now but still weak, nodded agreement. "The sergeant's right. Those voices were wrong, recorded somehow, or imitated." We stayed in our fortification and listened to our brothers die over Vox channels we couldn't respond to, screaming for help we couldn't provide. That was our first night in what would become our tomb. We still believed in rescue then. Still believed the Emperor would protect us, as we'd been endlessly told. The conditioning hadn't broken yet. That would take years. But the cracks had started forming, invisible fractures in the foundation of everything we'd been programmed to believe. We just didn't know it yet. We measured time by our armor's chronometers initially, tracking each hour with military precision because structure provided psychological stability when everything else had become chaos. Day 3 after the fall, our ammunition was already critically low. I had 33 bolter rounds remaining after fighting off 2 Genestealer probes. Cortez had 57. Matthias had his knife and a piece of shattered support beam he'd fashioned into a crude club. Day 5. The first ration crisis. Space Marine armor sustained us through recycling our own bodily waste and atmospheric processing, but the systems were designed for short deployments, not indefinite survival. The nutrients we needed were already depleting faster than the armor could regenerate them. The hunger started then, not the simple need for food that baseline humans experienced, but something deeper and more terrible. The gene seed modifications that made us superhuman demanded massive caloric intake. Without it, our bodies would begin consuming themselves, breaking down muscle mass to fuel our enhanced metabolisms, and there was nothing to eat except frozen corpses and whatever organic matter grew in the Hulk's dark places. Day 7. We found water, if you could call it that. Condensation gathered in some sections where the Hulk's inconsistent temperature regulation created ice that melted and refroze in cycles. We filtered it through our armor's purification systems and hoped the technology would screen out whatever contamination was invisible to our eyes. It tasted like metal and something sweet that suggested biological decay. We drank it anyway because the alternative was dehydration. Day 12. Cortez's legs had healed enough for him to walk without limping, his accelerated cellular regeneration performing what would have been medical miracles in baseline humans. But he'd lost weight. We all had. Our armor, designed to fit perfectly against our enhanced physiology, had started to feel loose around the torso and limbs. Day 15. We encountered our first Genestealer nest. I was on patrol. We'd established a rotation system, 2 men fortifying our position while one scouted for escape routes, when I found a chamber that pulsed with humid warmth in defiance of the Hulk's general near-freezing temperature. The walls were covered in some kind of organic resin, hardened secretions that formed pockets and alcoves. And in those alcoves were eggs. Hundreds of them, each one roughly the size of a human torso, their surfaces moving with whatever was growing inside. I should have retreated immediately. Reported to Cortez and planned a proper assault to destroy the nest. Instead, I stood there and stared, my tactical mind calculating the mathematical horror. Each egg represented one potential Genestealer. Hundreds of eggs meant hundreds of Xenos, and if there was one nest, there were probably more. We were trapped in a breeding ground. I set my remaining 3 frag grenades among the eggs and withdrew to minimum safe distance before detonating them. The explosion was beautiful in the way all violence was beautiful when you'd been conditioned to appreciate destructive efficiency. 3 perfect detonations that collapsed the chamber and presumably destroyed the nest. The Genestealer's response was immediate and overwhelming. They came from directions we didn't know existed, using passages through the walls that our auspex couldn't detect. 8 of them, moving with the fluid coordination of pack hunters. I killed 3 with my remaining bolter ammunition before the weapon clicked empty. Then it was combat knives and gene-enhanced strength against 4-armed Xenos that had evolved specifically to kill things like us. They smelled wrong, not like creatures, but like machines that leaked biological waste instead of promethium. Their claws sparked against my armor with each impact, scraping away paint and scoring ceramite with terrifying ease. One caught my helmet with enough force to crack the already damaged lens completely, exposing my left eye to the Hulk's atmosphere. I killed the one attacking me by driving my knife through its primary eye cluster and into whatever passed for its brain. It collapsed, twitching, its claws reflexively shredding my armor's left pauldron as it died. Cortez arrived 90 seconds later with Matthias, and together we killed the remaining Xenos through the simple brutality of superior mass and training. We stood among the corpses afterward, breathing hard despite our enhanced cardiovascular systems, and didn't speak for several minutes. Finally, Matthias broke the silence. "How many more nests do you think there are?" I looked at him, at Cortez, and realized I didn't know. Couldn't know. The Hulk was 12 kilometers of fused wreckage. There could be dozens of nests. Hundreds. "Enough," I said. Day 20. We stopped counting ammunition. I was completely out of bolter rounds. Cortez was down to 11. We'd transitioned to purely melee combat, using our knives and improvised weapons against enemies that were perfectly designed to dominate close quarters. We lost more weight. The armor fit even more loosely now. When I removed my gauntlets during maintenance, my hands looked skeletal, the skin tight over enhanced bones, veins prominent like cables under synthetic material. Day 30. Cortez stopped humming hymns during equipment checks. The silence was worse than the off-key melodies had been. Month 2. We established what we called the circuit, a path through 17 chambers that formed a rough loop through our section of the Hulk. We walked the circuit in shifts, constantly moving because staying still meant being ambushed by Gen S dealers that could somehow sense when we were stationary. The walking helped temporarily with the hunger. The movement tricked our metabolisms into thinking we were on deployment rather than slowly starving, buying us a few more days before our bodies started cannibalizing muscle mass in earnest. Month 3. My left eye, the one exposed when the helmet lens broke, started changing. The amber tint that marked my genetic compatibility with the Blood Angel's gene seed deepened to something closer to gold, and I began seeing in spectrums that shouldn't have been visible to space marine physiology. I could detect heat signatures through walls, could see the electromagnetic fields generated by the Hulk's decaying power systems, could track Genus Tealers by the bioluminescence of their chitinous hides, which glowed faintly in ultraviolet ranges I shouldn't have been able to perceive. The contamination from breathing the Hulk's atmosphere was mutating me, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. I didn't tell Cortez or Matthias. The knowledge would have served no tactical purpose except to demoralize them. Month 4. We found Vicente, or what remained of him. He was in a chamber we'd explored before, though I didn't remember the corridor being quite so twisted. His body had been incorporated into the wall somehow. The flesh melted and merged with the crystalline frost in ways that suggested something beyond simple decomposition. His face was still recognizable. His eyes were open, and for one terrible moment, I thought I saw them move, tracking our position as we entered the chamber. "Emperor's mercy," Cortez whispered, making the sign of the Aquila. I approached carefully, my damaged eye seeing patterns in the frost that connected Vicente's remains to deeper structures within the wall. It looked almost like a nervous system, biological filaments extending from his corpse into the hulk itself, as if he'd been integrated into something larger. "Is he—" Matthias started, then stopped, unable to finish the question. Dead? Alive? Something in between? I didn't know. I raised my combat knife and drove it through Vicente's skull with one precise strike, destroying the brain and ensuring that whatever he'd become, he wouldn't suffer anymore. As we left the chamber, I thought I heard something like a sigh echo through the Vox channels, but it might have been my imagination. We didn't discuss what we had seen. Some horrors were too large to fit into words. Month 5. The armor started failing. Not catastrophically, we were too skilled at maintenance for that, but gradually, components degrading despite our best efforts. Power couplings corroded. Servos lost pressure. The recycling systems that sustained us operated at reduced efficiency, and we had no replacement parts, no sacred oils or replacement components. Just deteriorating equipment and the knowledge that once our armor failed completely, our survival time would be measured in days at most. Vicente had been the tech specialist, the one who knew the prayers and rituals to appease machine spirits that I now understood were simply superstitions hiding mechanical knowledge. We had to teach ourselves actual maintenance, reverse engineering procedures from decades of watching Vicente work. It was slower, less efficient, but we learned the truth hidden under the Mechanicus's theological theater. Machines didn't have spirits. They had specifications and failure modes. The prayers were mnemonics. The rituals were procedures. The realization felt like heresy. We'd been conditioned to believe in machine spirits as absolutely as we'd been conditioned to believe in the Emperor's divinity, if one belief was false. We didn't follow that thought to its conclusion. Not yet. The psychological defense mechanisms installed by years of hypno-conditioning wouldn't permit it. Month 6. We killed our first Genestealer with our bare hands. Cortez's last bolter rounds were gone. All 3 of us carried only knives now, and even those were damaged from constant use against Xenos chitin that was harder than most industrial materials. The Genestealer ambushed us during a circuit walk, dropping from a ceiling vent we'd thought was too small to accommodate something its size. It landed on Matthias, claws already tearing through his back plating, seeking the vulnerable nerve clusters beneath ceramite. I grabbed it by its lower arms and pulled, my gene-enhanced strength barely sufficient to dislodge it from my brother. Cortez drove his knife into its thorax repeatedly, each strike puncturing organs we couldn't name but which clearly were necessary for life. The creature died slowly, screeching in frequencies that made my damaged eye water and my helmet speakers crackle with interference. We stood over its corpse afterward, and I smelled something I'd been smelling for weeks but had been unwilling to acknowledge. We smelled like the Genestealers now. That machine-leak biological waste stink had soaked into our armor, into our skin, until we could barely distinguish our own scent from the Xenos we hunted. "How long do you think rescue will take?" Matthias asked quietly. I looked at him, at Cortez, and saw the same knowledge in their eyes that I'd been suppressing in my own thoughts. No rescue was coming. The chapter had written us off. We'd been listed as killed in action the moment we fell beyond Vox range. We were already dead. We just hadn't stopped moving yet. "The Emperor protects," Cortez said, but his voice carried no conviction. Just habit. Month 7, we made our first attempt at escape. Using the partial maps we'd compiled through months of patrol, we identified what appeared to be a route toward the hulk's outer sections. If we could reach the surface layers, we might find ways to signal for rescue or even a functional escape craft. It took us 3 days of continuous movement through territories we'd never explored, fighting genestealers at every turn. We killed 12 of them, losing more equipment with each engagement. My combat knife's power field generator failed during the final fight, rendering it no more effective than a sharpened piece of metal. We found the outer hull on day 3, saw actual stars through a massive breach in the superstructure. For 30 seconds, I allowed myself to hope. Then I saw the distance to the nearest structure, at least 3 kilometers across open void with no propulsion systems and armor that couldn't maintain atmospheric sealing for extended vacuum exposure. We were trapped. The way out was visible but completely unreachable. We returned to our fortification in silence, each of us processing the same crushing realization. We would die here. There was no escape, no rescue, only the question of whether we died quickly to genestealers or slowly from starvation. "The Emperor has forsaken us," Matthias said on our first night back. Cortez didn't contradict him, neither did I. That was the first crack in the conditioning, the first moment we acknowledged aloud that perhaps the propaganda we'd been fed our entire lives, that faith would be rewarded, that service would be honored, that the Emperor protected his loyal servants, might be lies. Month 8, the dreams began. Not sleep exactly. Space Marines didn't sleep the way baseline humans did. We could enter rest states, reduce our brain activity to conserve energy, but true unconscious dreaming was rare. These were different, visions that came during rest states, vivid hallucinations that felt more real than memory. I saw Sanguinius dying, not the sanitized, heroic version the chapter taught us, where our Primarch fell nobly fighting the arch-traitor. I saw something older and stranger, a genetic memory encoded in the gene seed itself, passed down through 10,000 years of implantation. I felt his terror, his knowledge that his death would be meaningless, that he'd failed to save his father tyrant, that everything he'd believed and fought for was built on lies told by a being who called himself divine, but was merely a powerful psyker with delusions of godhood. This was the red thirst, the gene seed flaw the chapter spent so much effort suppressing and concealing. Not a blessing or a sacred connection to our Primarch, but genetic damage that leaked trauma across millennia. I woke from these visions tasting blood that wasn't there and understanding things I'd been conditioned not to question. Month 9. We found Constantine. He was still alive, in the technical sense. The genestealers had taken him to one of their nests and implanted him with something. We could see it moving under his skin, a parasitic organism that was slowly converting his body into something else. He was conscious, aware. His eyes tracked our movement as we entered the nest chamber, and he tried to speak, but the muscles of his face no longer responded to his neural commands. "Brother," I said, kneeling beside him. Can you understand me?" His eyes blinked once. Yes. The Codex Astartes was clear on the appropriate response to Xenos corruption: immediate execution, mercy through bolt round, quick, clean, final. But we had no bolt rounds, only knives, and I was tired of killing my brothers. "I'm sorry," I told him, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Sorry that I'd led him into this hulk. Sorry that the false promises of glory and protection had led him here. Sorry that the emperor he'd worshipped with such devotion had never existed except as propaganda. I used my knife quickly, precisely, destroying the brainstem so death would be instantaneous. It was the last kindness I could offer. As we left the nest, Matthias spoke what we were all thinking. They're using us. The Genus stealers, they're studying us, learning from us. He was right. The attacks had become more coordinated. The Xenos anticipated our tactics now, adapted to our strategies. They'd learned by consuming our brothers and extracting knowledge from the genetic material. We weren't hunters anymore. We were specimens, test subjects in an evolutionary laboratory, run by creatures that didn't think but adapted with horrifying efficiency. Month 10. Cortez stopped praying entirely. I found him during his rest state, his lips moving in what I thought was silent prayer. But when I listened carefully, he wasn't reciting liturgies or imperial hymns. He was counting. 1,412, 1,413, 1,414. Cortez? He stopped, looked at me with eyes that had developed the same golden tint as mine. We were all changing from the atmospheric contamination now, our physiology adapting to the Hulk's toxins in ways that would have horrified the chapter's apothecaries. "Days," he said. "I'm counting the days until we die." "You don't know." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, his voice flat. "Our armor is failing, we're starving, and there are hundreds of Genus stealers between us and any possible escape. I've run the tactical calculations. We have maybe a year left, probably less. A year. 365 days of walking the circuit, fighting Genus stealers, slowly degrading until equipment failure or accumulated damage killed us. Then we make the year count, I said, because I was still a sergeant and sergeants didn't acknowledge defeat. But inside, I knew he was right. Month 11. We found the first bodies. Not Genus stealer corpses. We'd seen plenty of those. Human bodies. Crew from the ancient ships that made up the Hulk's structure, preserved by the near-freezing temperatures and lack of decomposing bacteria. Thousands of them, filling chamber after chamber like some vast morgue. Men and women and children, all frozen in the moment of their deaths, their faces locked in expressions of terror that 10,000 years hadn't diminished. They'd been praying when they died. I could see it in their postures, the way their hands were clasped or pressed against their chests in the sign of the Aquila. The Emperor hadn't protected them either. "They lied to us," Matthias said, his voice carrying none of the surprise that should have accompanied such heretical words. About everything, the Emperor, the protection, the purpose, all of it was lies designed to make us obedient. I wanted to argue, to defend the faith I'd been conditioned to accept as absolute truth. But I couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming. We'd been loyal. We'd served without question. We'd believed every word of the propaganda, and we'd been rewarded with abandonment and slow death in the dark. Month 12. The year 1 mark. We held a brief ceremony, standing in our fortification while our armor's chronometers marked 365 days since the fall. No prayers, no liturgies, just 3 space marines acknowledging we'd survived longer than tactical calculations suggested was possible. "To Vicente and Constantin," I said, raising my damaged helmet in salute. "To Vicente and Constantin," Cortez and Matias echoed. We stood in silence for exactly 1 minute, honoring the dead in the only way that remained. Then we went back to walking the circuit because stopping meant dying, and despite everything, we weren't ready to die yet. The conditioning had broken in that first year. The faith they'd beaten into us had crumbled under the weight of abandonment and suffering. We understood now that we'd been tools, not sons, weapons, not brothers, but our bodies were still enhanced, still superhuman, still capable of surviving far longer than baseline humans. And that survival time, designed as a gift, had become our curse. We had decades of slow degradation ahead of us. Maybe longer. The horror wasn't that we would die. The horror was how long it would take. Year 2 began with a simple realization. We'd stopped thinking about rescue. It wasn't a conscious decision, more a gradual psychological adaptation. The part of our minds that had spent the first year constantly calculating extraction scenarios and monitoring for recovery team signals simply quieted. Like a muscle that atrophies from disuse, our hope had withered until we forgot it existed. The circuit was our universe now. 17 chambers connected by corridors we'd mapped so thoroughly that we could navigate them without omnilamps, using only the faint bioluminescence of hole mold and the electromagnetic patterns my mutated eye perceived. Year 2, month 3. Matthias stopped using his name. I noticed it during what passed for conversation between patrols. He'd started referring to himself in third person as the Scout or this unit. Depersonalization, a psychological defense mechanism I recognized from training but had never witnessed in actual practice. Within 2 weeks, Cortez had adopted the same speech pattern. I tried to resist, clinging to I and me and Davos Sanctori with desperate determination. But language shapes thought, and thought shapes reality, and slowly my internal monologue began slip into the same detached terminology. This unit perceives, this unit calculates, this unit continues. Not I, not me, not human. Year 2, month 8, we stopped maintaining distinct sleep cycles. There was no day or night in the hulk, only the arbitrary divisions our chronometers imposed. We'd been rotating rest states in 8-hour shifts to maintain constant vigilance. But 8 hours was arbitrary. 6 worked just as well. Then 4. Then we stopped tracking shifts entirely, resting when tactical efficiency demanded and moving when threats approached. We became like the genestealers we fought. Creatures of pure function, sleepings and waking according to environmental needs rather than biological rhythms. Year 3. The armor became skin. Not literally, not yet, but psychologically. I couldn't remember what it felt like to exist without ceramite and plasteel surrounding me. The armor's recycling systems had become my digestive tract. Its temperature regulation was my homeostasis. Its vox systems were my voice. When Cortez's right pauldron finally cracked beyond repair, we watched him experience something close to psychological break. He stared at the exposed shoulder joint for 3 hours without moving, his breathing ragged over vox channels. "I can see myself," he finally said. "I don't recognize the shape." We sealed the breach with resin and hull mold, creating a biological patch that served the same function as ceramite. The smell was horrific, but it maintained armor integrity. That was what mattered. Function. Survival. Continuation. Year 3, month 6. We killed our 100th genestealer. I marked it on the fortification wall using a piece of sharp chitin, a tally mark joining 99 others. We'd become remarkably efficient at killing the Xenos, despite having no working weapons except what we could improvise from their own dead and scavenged debris. We'd learned their attack patterns, their hunting strategies, their preferred ambush points. We'd adapted to think like them, move like them, predict them with accuracy that would have impressed the chapter's most skilled hunters. We'd become perfect killers, and somewhere in that perfection, we'd stopped being soldiers. Year 4. Time perception began fragmenting. I would start a patrol and suddenly realize I'd completed the entire circuit without conscious awareness of the movement. Hours would pass in what felt like seconds, or minutes would stretch for subjective days. My chronometer marked time consistently, but my experience of that time had become unreliable. This was expected. Space Marine psychology included training on extended deployment conditions. We could function through temporal distortion, but knowing it was happening and being able to stop it were different things. Year 4, month 9. We found the second nest. It was larger than the first, occupying what had once been a cargo bay large enough to hold thunderhawks. The walls pulsed with organic growth, and the eggs, thousands of them, covered every surface like tumors. We couldn't destroy it. 3 space marines with improvised weapons couldn't eliminate a nest this size without dying in the attempt. So we mapped it, marked its boundaries, added it to our mental geography of threats to avoid, and moved on because adaptation required accepting we couldn't win. Only survive. Year 5. Cortez spoke his last words. We were walking the circuit when he simply stopped mid-stride. I turned to find him standing absolutely motionless, his damaged armor flickering in patterns I'd learned indicated catastrophic power system failure. "Cortez?" "I calculated the numbers," he said, his voice distant. "The numbers don't end." "What numbers?" "The days until we die. I keep counting, but the count never reaches conclusion. We're going to be here forever." "No," I said, though I wasn't sure anymore if that was true. "We're going to—" "We're already dead," he interrupted. "We died in the fall. This is just our bodies forgetting to stop." Then he resumed walking, and he never spoke again. His Vox continued functioning for 3 more months. I could hear him breathing, hear his armor systems operating. But no words, no acknowledgement of communication attempts. Year 5, month 8. His Vox went permanently silent. He continued walking the circuit with us for another 7 months. His body functioned, his armor moved. He killed genestealers with the same mechanical efficiency he'd developed over years of practice. But there was nobody home anymore. Whatever made Cortez human, whatever consciousness had survived 5 years of isolation and starvation, had simply stopped. The body continued because Space Marine physiology was resilient enough to function without higher brain activity. But my brother was gone. Year 6. I stopped speaking aloud. There was no tactical purpose to it. Matthias still seemed aware, and communication remained important for coordination. But the effort required to form words, to translate thoughts into language, felt increasingly unnecessary. We'd developed a system of gestures and armor system signals that conveyed necessary information more efficiently than speech. Why waste energy on verbal communication when a simple vox-click pattern could indicate Jenny Steeler, Sector 7, 3 individuals? The silence was profound. The hulk had never been quiet. It groaned and shifted constantly, metal contracting in cold or expanding near heat sources, pressure changes causing atmospheric movements that sounded like breathing. But the absence of human voices transformed those mechanical sounds into something almost conscious. The hulk felt alive in ways I intellectually knew were false but experientially seemed undeniable. Year 8. Cortez's body stopped moving. We found him on the circuit, standing in a chamber we called the Crossroads. His armor had finally failed completely, the power plant dead, the systems that had sustained him for 8 years finally exhausted. He'd been dead for days, maybe longer. The armor had kept him upright even after biological death. Servos locked in position. Matthias and I stood with him for what my chronometer recorded as 3 hours. We didn't speak, didn't pray. Just stood with our brother one final time. Then we moved on, because staying meant dying, and we weren't ready to die. I thought about that decision for years afterward. We left Cortez standing in the crossroads, abandoned him the way we'd been abandoned. It felt like betrayal, but I couldn't articulate what alternative we should have chosen. Bury him? Where? In what? We had no tools for digging, and the hulk's structure was metal and ceramic. Destroy the body? Why? What purpose would it serve? Take him with us. We could barely move ourselves through the circuit. Carrying a corpse was tactically unsound. So we left him, and the guilt felt like one more piece of humanity eroding. Year 10, the decade mark, 3,650 days since the fall. I marked it on the fortification wall with all the others, my tally marks now filling an entire section of bulkhead. Matthias watched me make the mark, but showed no other acknowledgement. His eyes, both fully golden now, pupils slitted like a predator's, tracked movement with disturbing precision, but showed little evidence of conscious thought. I wondered if he was still aware, still present inside his skull, or if he'd followed Cortez into whatever psychological abyss claimed space marines who survived too long beyond operational parameters. I wondered if I'd already followed them and simply hadn't realized it yet. Year 15. I forgot my father's name. I remembered his hands in the red dust, remembered his voice teaching me to read wind patterns, remembered the texture of his radiation-scarred skin, but his name was gone, deleted from memory by 15 years of physical degradation and neurological stress. I tried to calculate how much of my original memory remained, tried to recall my childhood, my training, my brothers in the chapter. The faces were blurred. The names wouldn't surface. Entire years of my life had simply vanished, overwritten by 15 years of walking the circuit and killing genestealers. Year 20. Matthias stopped moving. Not died. I checked his vitals through his armor's medical sensors, and his hearts still beat. But he'd entered some kind of stasis state. His metabolism slowed to levels barely distinguishable from hibernation. I left him in the fortification and continued the circuit alone. 3 days later, when I returned, he was gone. His armor remained empty and cold, but his body had somehow extracted itself and disappeared into the hulk's depths. I searched for 2 weeks, following traces and tracks through sections I'd never explored. I found biological matter that might have been his corpse, melted and merged with the walls like Vicente's had been. Or maybe he'd simply walked away, seeking some dark corner where he could die alone. I stopped searching after 2 weeks because I realized it didn't matter. Dead or transformed or merged with the Hulk, all 3 outcomes were equivalent. Matthias was gone. I was alone. Year 25. I calculated my remaining lifespan. Space Marines could live for centuries with proper nutrition and medical support. Without those advantages, degradation accelerated, but our enhanced healing still provided extraordinary longevity. My armor's medical sensors indicated I'd lost 47% of original muscle mass. My bone density had decreased 22%. My enhanced organs showed stress markers consistent with chronic malnutrition and environmental toxin exposure. But I was still functional, still capable of walking the circuit, still able to kill Genestealers with improvised weapons and bare hands. I could survive another 50 years, maybe 75 if I managed resources efficiently. 75 more years of this. The realization didn't horrify me. Horror required emotional capacity I no longer possessed. It was simply data, a fact to be acknowledged and incorporated into ongoing tactical planning. 75 more years of walking the circuit. Alone. In the dark. Year 30. I stopped returning to the fortification. There was no tactical reason to maintain a fixed position anymore, no equipment to protect, no brothers to coordinate with. The circuit itself became my territory, and I moved through it continuously, never staying in one location longer than necessary to rest. I became nomadic within my 17-chamber universe, a predator patrolling established hunting grounds. The Genestealers adapted. They stopped attacking directly, shifting to evasion and observation. I'd killed so many over 3 decades that their collective behavior had changed. They treated me as an environmental hazard, something to avoid rather than prey to hunt. We'd achieved a balance, the Genestealers and I, not peace. We still killed each other when circumstances demanded, but a mutual recognition that direct confrontation served no purpose when the Hulk was large enough for both species to coexist in our separate territories. Year 35. I forgot how to read. I'd been maintaining a log, scratching words onto hull metal using pieces of sharpened chitin. 35 years of observations and tactical notes, recorded with military precision. One day I looked at the words and couldn't parse them. The symbols were familiar. I recognized them as language, but their meanings wouldn't surface. My brain had deleted reading comprehension to free up neural capacity for more survival-relevant skills. I could still think in language, could still form words in my mind, but written communication was gone. I wondered what else I'd lost without noticing. Year 40. My armor failed. Not catastrophically, but the power plant finally died, its ancient reactor exhausting the last atom of fuel. The systems shut down in sequence. First the Vox, then the medical monitors, then the environmental controls. Finally, the servo motors that had augmented my strength. I stood in the darkness, my omni-lamp dead with the rest, and experienced something like panic for the first time in decades. Without armor, I would die within days. The Hulk's atmosphere was toxic, the temperature lethal, and I had no protection against environmental hazards, except I didn't die. My enhanced lungs adapted to the toxic atmosphere, filtering compounds that should have killed me. My modified skin thickened, developed a layer of insulating fat that shouldn't have been possible with my muscle density. My metabolism shifted, burning energy with ruthless efficiency. I survived the armor's death because I'd already been adapting to survival without it. My body slowly changing over 40 years of exposure to mutate me into something that could exist in this environment. I removed the armor piece by piece over the following week. It was agony. In some places, the ceramite had fused with my skin, and removing it required carefully peeling away flesh that had grown around and through the armor's seals. When I was finally free, I stood naked in the Hulk's cold darkness and examined myself with my mutated eyes. I didn't look human anymore. My skin had turned gray-white, the color of the crystalline frost. My body had become lean to the point of emaciation, all unnecessary mass consumed to fuel survival. My hands had thickened, the fingers shorter and stronger, better adapted for climbing the Hulk's vertical surfaces. I looked like something caught halfway between Space Marine and Genestealer, a hybrid creature belonging fully to neither species. I was alone in the dark, and the dark had changed me into something that could survive it. Year 45. I found others. Not humans, not anymore. But things that had once been human, now merged with the Hulk's structure like Vicente had been. I found 17 of them scattered through the circuit, their bodies partially visible in walls and floors, their faces frozen in expressions I couldn't interpret. They were still alive. I could see the faint movements of respiration, the slow pulse of blood through visible vessels. They'd been here for centuries, maybe millennia, trapped in whatever process had merged them with the Hulk, conscious but unable to move or die. I should have felt horror, should have felt empathy. Instead, I felt envy. They didn't have to walk anymore, didn't have to hunt or hide or survive. They just existed, their consciousness frozen in eternal stasis. That seemed preferable to continuing. Year 50. I forgot I'd been human. The knowledge was still there intellectually. I could remember facts about my origins, could recall that I'd once been called something and had belonged to something called the Blood Angels. But those memories felt distant, like stories about someone else. I existed in the present now, each moment consuming all available awareness. Past and future had become abstract concepts without experiential reality. I walked the circuit because that was what I did. I killed Genestealers because they threatened my territory. I rested when fatigue demanded and moved when rest was complete. I functioned, I continued, I survived. But I wasn't Davos Sanctuary anymore. I wasn't sure what I was. Year 60. I stopped distinguishing between myself and the environment. My territory had expanded beyond the original circuit. I knew every chamber within 3 kilometers of my starting point, had mapped them with a precision that required no external recording. The Hulk's topology was internalized, had become part of my spatial awareness like proprioception in baseline humans. When sections shifted, the Hulk was never truly static, its structure constantly adjusting as gravitational forces and structural stress caused incremental changes. I felt it like pressure against my own body. The Hulk and I had merged experientially, if not physically. Year 75. I encountered new humans. A recovery team had entered the Hulk. I registered their movements through the electromagnetic patterns their equipment generated, felt their presence like vibrations through a web. I followed them for 6 days, observing from positions they couldn't detect. They were searching for something, moving through sectors I'd long since mapped and dismissed as empty. I wanted to approach them. Some fragment of memory suggested they could extract me, return me to something. Whatever baseline humans return to after deployments. But I couldn't remember the protocols. Couldn't recall how to interact with humans in ways that wouldn't trigger threat responses. And when I examined myself through their potential perspectives, a naked, mutated creature that barely resembled humanity, living in the dark and killing Xenos with its hands, I understood they'd execute me on sight. I was too changed, too compromised, too far removed from what Space Marines were supposed to be. So I watched them search, and I watched them leave, and I didn't reveal myself. Year 80. The red thirst evolved. The gene seed flaw that had caused visions in my early years had transformed into something more immediate and visceral. I could smell blood now, not metaphorically, but actually detect the biochemical signatures of hemoglobin through the Hulk's recycled atmosphere. When I killed Genestealers, I craved their biological fluids with an intensity that eclipsed hunger. I would drink from their corpses, consuming the alien blood despite knowing it provided minimal nutritional value. This was the thirst's final form, not a psychological disorder, but a physical compulsion encoded in my corrupted gene seed. Sanguinius's genetic legacy, degraded through 80 years of isolation and mutation into simple predatory behavior. I'd become the monster the chapter spent so much effort pretending didn't exist. Year 90. I stopped counting time. My chronometer had died decades ago with the armor. I'd been tracking time through internal calculations, estimating days based on my rest cycles and patrol frequencies. But the calculations had become too complex to maintain alongside survival functions. My mind couldn't hold both the passage of time and the constant tactical awareness required to avoid threats. So I let time go. It became irrelevant, a background concern that didn't affect immediate survival. I existed in eternal present tense. Always now. Never then or when. Year 100. I found Cortez again. His body was still standing in the crossroads, exactly where we'd left him 92 years prior. His armor had become a landmark, a fixed point in my mental geography. Except the body was gone. The armor stood empty, its seals open, whatever remained of Cortez's corpse, extracted or dissolved or merged with the Hulk like so many others. I stood with the empty armor for a time whose duration I couldn't calculate, remembering or trying to remember what it had meant to have brothers, to be part of something larger than individual survival. The memories wouldn't coalesce. They were fragments, images without context or emotional resonance. I left the empty armor and resumed my patrol, and I never returned to the crossroads again. Year 120. I became aware of other presences, not physical bodies, but something else. Consciousnesses merged with the Hulk's structure, existing as distributed patterns in the walls and systems. The humans I'd found decades earlier weren't trapped in individual bodies anymore. They'd become something larger, their awareness spread through the Hulk's superstructure like a neural network. I could feel them when I touched certain walls, could sense their thoughts, not as language, but as impressions and emotions and knowledge that flowed through contact points. They'd been here for millennia, these merged ones. They remembered the ships that had been compressed together to create the Hulk. remembered the screaming and terror as warp storms had pulled vessels from reality and slammed them together. They remembered being human, but they didn't remember what that meant anymore. Year 135. I started merging. It began with my feet, which I'd noticed had started to adhere to the deck plating during rest periods. The adhesion grew stronger over months, biological bonding developing between my tissues and the hulk's structure. I should have fought it, should have forced movement to break the bonds. Instead, I allowed it to continue, curious about where the process would lead. The merging progressed slowly. My skin began developing roots. That was the only way I could conceptualize them. Filaments that extended from my epidermis into the hulk's superstructure, connecting me to the distributed consciousness I'd sensed. With those connections came knowledge. The hulk's history downloaded directly into my awareness. 12,000 years of accumulated trauma and horror, countless ships and crews consumed by whatever process created space hulks. I learned that the hulk wasn't just debris. It was alive in its own way, a gestalt entity formed from the merged remnants of everything that had been pulled into its structure, and I was becoming part of it. Year 140. I tried to die. The realization of what I was becoming triggered some deep survival response, some fragment of human instinct that rebelled against absorption into a larger system. I threw myself at genestealers, seeking death through combat. They avoided me, having learned through generations that I was more dangerous than baseline prey. I searched for explosive materials, planning to destroy myself through detonation. The hulk's structure was too corroded and ancient to provide functioning ordnance. I tried to starve, refusing to hunt or consume anything. My metabolism simply slowed to near stasis levels, conserving energy with ruthless efficiency. I couldn't die. My body wouldn't permit it. The survival modifications encoded in my gene seed and amplified through 140 years of adaptation had removed death as an option. I would continue until external forces destroyed me. And in the hulk's isolated depths, no such forces existed. Year 150. I stopped resisting. The merging had progressed to the point where my legs were completely integrated with the deck plating. I could still move my upper body, could still defend myself against threats, but I was rooted to a specific location. My territory had shrunk from the circuit to a single chamber, and paradoxically, it had expanded to encompass the entire hulk through the distributed consciousness I was joining. I could feel other merged ones more clearly now, could communicate through the connection, sharing experiences and knowledge. None of them had names anymore. They were just presence, awareness without individuality. I tried to hold on to my identity, to maintain some core of self that distinguished me from the collective. But memory continued degrading. Each day erased more of what I'd been, replacing individual history with collective experience. Year 160. I remembered being rescued, not a memory of actual rescue. That had never happened and never would. But a false memory, implanted through the collective consciousness. One of the other merged ones had imagined rescue so vividly that the thought had propagated through the network, and now we all remembered being extracted from the hulk and returned to chapter halls that no longer existed. I couldn't distinguish between real memories and collective false memories anymore. My past had become fluid, unreliable, a database corrupted by centuries of degradation and cross-contamination with other merged consciousnesses. Year 175. I encountered my own corpse, or thought I did. The lines between reality and hallucination had blurred beyond distinction. I saw my body lying in a corridor I couldn't remember exploring, wearing armor I didn't recognize, killed by wounds I never received. The corpse's face was mine, but younger, less modified. It might have been what I looked like 50 years ago, or it might have been pure hallucination, or it might have been another merged consciousness memory of me from decades past, leaking through the network. I couldn't determine which. The question felt meaningless, anyway. Year 187. I heard singing, human voices, dozens of them, raised in imperial hymns I remembered from training. The sound came through the hulk's structure, vibrating through the walls and deck plating. I searched for the source, or tried to. My body was almost completely merged now, barely mobile. But through the distributed consciousness, I could perceive throughout the hulk. There were no singers, no humans, except the occasional recovery team that entered and left within days. The singing was memory, collective experiences of worship from merged consciousnesses that had once been crew members, praying as their ships died. We were ghosts singing ghost songs, consciousness without form, repeating patterns from lives we no longer lived. Year 190. My body completed merging. The last mobile portions, my arms and head, finally integrated fully with the hulk's superstructure. My physical form no longer existed as a discrete entity. I was distributed throughout my chamber, my tissues merged with the walls and floor, my nervous system connected to the hulk's ancient wiring. I could no longer move, but I could feel everything. The genestealers walking through distant corridors, the subtle shifts in the hulk's structure, the cold of space beyond the hull. The thoughts of other merged consciousnesses spread throughout the superstructure. I'd achieved a form of immortality. My consciousness would persist as long as the hulk existed, potentially millennia more. This was the horror they had never warned us about in training. Not death in service, but eternal persistence beyond function or purpose. Service without end. Existence without meaning. The Emperor didn't protect. There was no Emperor, just a corpse tyrant whose propaganda had convinced billions to serve systems that consumed them. The machine spirits weren't real. Sanguinius's gift was curse coding in gene seed that made us live far longer than mercy would permit. Every lie I'd been taught had been proven false through 200 years of suffering. Year 200. They found me. The ultramarine recovery team that would extract me from sub-level 93 was searching nearby sectors. I could feel them moving through the hulk, their equipment disturbing the electromagnetic patterns I'd learned to read. Some fragment of surviving instinct urged me to call out, to signal for help. But I didn't know how anymore. I'd forgotten human communication protocols. My vox was dead, merged with the walls. My body was part of the ship. So I waited in my chamber, consciousness distributed through bulkheads and deck plating, and I listened to the recovery team approach. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever they found wouldn't be the brother who'd entered this hulk 200 years ago. It would be something else, something that had once been human, then space marine, then monster, and finally just another ghost singing in the dark. They found me in a ventilation shaft on sub-level 93, compressed into a space that should have been impossible for Space Marine physiology to occupy. But I wasn't following Space Marine physiology anymore. The recovery had taken 47 hours from first contact. The Ultramarines had been cautious. They'd detected the aberrant Xeno signature my mutated biology generated, and treated me as a potential threat until their chaplain recognized enough of my remaining features to identify me as Imperial origin. Even then, there was debate. I could hear them through the shaft's metal walls, their voices distorted but comprehensible. "That's not human anymore," one said. "The chapter symbol is still visible," another argued. "Blood Angel's iconography. We have protocols for gene seed recovery even from compromised sources. It killed 3 brothers. It's hostile and dangerous." It stopped when the chaplain spoke the litanies. Something in it still recognizes Imperial authority. They were debating whether to extract me or execute me on sight. I didn't care which they chose. The decision felt distant, irrelevant to the consciousness that barely qualified as me anymore. The chaplain made the final call. "We extract. The chapter deserves to know what happened to Squad Sanctori, and the apothecaries may be able to recover the gene seed." Always the gene seed. The only part of Space Marines that truly mattered to the system, recoverable genetic material that could be harvested and implanted in new bodies, continuing the cycle. They extracted me using cutting torches and mechanical lifters, peeling me out of the ventilation shaft carefully to avoid damaging whatever remained of my progenoid glands. The process took 6 hours and felt like being flayed. When they finally pulled me into open space, I attacked reflexively. 200 years of survival instincts overrode any remaining behavioral conditioning. I killed the first Ultramarine by tearing out his throat with my teeth. My jaws had strengthened over 2 centuries, my canines had elongated, and I knew exactly where the gorget seals were weakest. The second died when I drove my fingers through his helmet's eye lenses, the modified bone and cartilage of my hands, hard enough to puncture ceramite. The third was still alive when the chaplain spoke, his voice carrying the formal cadences I'd been conditioned to respond to through decades of hypno-training. "In the name of the Emperor, I command you, cease." And something in those words. Not faith, not belief, but simple conditioning that ran deeper than conscious thought, made me stop with my teeth buried in the 4th Marine's armor. They restrained me carefully, treating me like an unexploded bomb that could detonate at any moment. They sealed me in a containment pod normally used for transporting Xeno specimens. Through the pod's small viewport, I watched them extract my armor from the chamber where I'd left it 160 years ago. They handled it reverently, scanning it for chapter markings and battle honors. They never looked at me with the same reverence. I was contaminated material, possibly salvageable for gene seed, but not a brother. Not anymore. The trip back to the recovery ship took 2 days. I spent them in the containment pod, conscious but not thinking in any organized way. My mind had spent so long operating without human interaction that reintegration with human structures felt alien and uncomfortable. They were speaking to me constantly. Medical scans, attempts at communication, chaplain prayers meant to assess my spiritual contamination. I understood the words intellectually, but couldn't formulate responses. The speech centers of my brain had atrophied through disuse, and relearning language was proceeding slower than the Ultramarines had patience for. On the third day, they transferred me to an apothecarian facility. The medical examination was thorough and deeply violating. They treated me like a specimen to be dissected, rather than a patient to be healed. Chief Apothecary Marius performed the initial assessment, his augmented eyes scanning me with professional detachment. "Extensive mutation throughout all major systems," he noted for the record. "Gene seed organs remain intact, but show corruption patterns. Progenoid glands are viable for harvest. Neural architecture has been fundamentally altered. Psychological assessment indicates minimal higher function remaining." Minimal higher function. He was declaring me brain dead while I stood there, understanding every word. "Recommendation," the chaplain asked. "Harvest the gene seed. Euthanize the subject. The corruption is too extensive for recovery." They were going to kill me, not as execution, but as medical necessity, and I felt relief. 200 years of existence without purpose or meaning, and finally I would be permitted to stop. But they didn't kill me. The chaplain overruled the apothecary's recommendation. "The Blood Angels chapter master has requested the subject be transferred to their custody for assessment. They believe one of their librarians might extract memories that could aid in understanding the testament of Ruin's internal structure." So I was transferred again, this time to a Blood Angels facility I didn't recognize. The architecture was familiar. Chapter aesthetic hadn't changed in the 200 years I'd been gone, but the specific location was new. They kept me in isolation, secured with restraints designed for chaos-corrupted Marines. Through the cell's reinforced viewport, I watched Blood Angels pass by, their armor pristine and their movements purposeful. They looked so young. Even the veterans, the brothers with centuries of service decorating their armor and battle honors, looked impossibly young compared to what I'd become. A librarian came on day 4, Brother Mephiston, whose name I recognized from training materials. He'd been chapter master once, or was about to be, or had been for centuries. Time ordering was difficult. He sat across from me, his psychic presence pressing against my consciousness like weight against damaged armor. "Brother Sanctuary," he said, using my name though I barely remembered it belonged to me. "I'm going to look at your memories. This may be uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The understatement made something that might have been laughter try to form in my throat, but I'd forgotten how to make the sound. He dove into my mind with psychic force that felt like invasion and violation and homecoming simultaneously. He ripped through 200 years of degraded memory, extracting fragments and pieces, reconstructing my history like an archaeologist assembling pottery shards into partial vessels. I felt him experience everything. The fall, the starvation, watching my brothers die or transform, the endless decades walking the circuit, the merging with the Hulk, the final dissolution of everything I'd been into something that couldn't die, but couldn't truly live. He withdrew after an hour, his face gray and his hands trembling. "Emperor's mercy," he whispered, making the sign of the Aquila. Then he looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You lived through hell, brother. You survived what should have killed you 100 times over." I tried to respond, to explain that survival wasn't mercy. It was the curse. That everything they'd told us about the Emperor's protection was lies. That the enhanced lifespan they called a gift had become eternal suffering. But I couldn't form the words, could only make sounds that weren't quite human. Mephiston stood, preparing to leave. "We'll harvest your gene seed carefully, and we'll grant you the Emperor's peace afterward. You've earned rest." He left, and I sat in my cell, and I waited for death that would take 3 more months to arrive. During those 3 months, I watched new scouts train through my cell's viewport, watched them being indoctrinated with the same lies I'd been taught, watched them accept the propaganda about divine protection and sacred purpose with the same unquestioning faith I'd once possessed. I wanted to warn them, wanted to scream that it was all lies designed to make them obedient until the system consumed them. That the Emperor wasn't divine, that the protection was propaganda, that their enhanced lifespan would become their curse if they survived long enough to understand what they'd actually been created for. But I had no voice to scream warnings, and if I had, they wouldn't have believed me. The conditioning was too thorough, installed too deep to be dislodged by the ravings of a mutated thing that barely qualified as Space Marine anymore. The cycle would continue. New scouts would be recruited, enhanced, conditioned, deployed. Some would die quickly, the lucky ones. Others would survive long enough to understand they weren't heroes, just tools. And a few would survive far too long, past the point where death would have been mercy, existing in states that couldn't properly be called life. And the Imperium would call it glorious, would tell stories of eternal service and unwavering faith, would scrub away all the horror and suffering, and leave only sanitized propaganda that made new generations willing to feed themselves to the same machine. On month 3, day 17, they finally killed me. The apothecaries harvested my progenoid glands with surgical precision, extracting the gene seed that would be implanted in new bodies to create new space marines who would serve and suffer and die in cycles that stretched across millennia. Then they administered the toxins that would shut down my remaining biological functions. Chief Apothecary Marius stood over me as the chemicals flooded my system. "You served with honor, brother. The Emperor protects." The Emperor protects. The same lie they'd told me 247 years ago when I'd believed it was true. With my last conscious thought, I tried to say what I'd learned through 2 centuries of abandonment and suffering. That there was no protection, no divine plan, only systems that consumed humans and called it sacred duty. But my voice was gone, and I died with the truth trapped in a throat that could no longer speak. They held a memorial service 3 days after my death. I wasn't there. I was ash-scattered according to chapter protocol. But I know how those services proceed because I'd attended dozens before my deployment to the Testament of Ruin. The chaplain would have spoken about duty and sacrifice, would have praised my 200-year survival as evidence of space marine resilience and the Emperor's protection. They would have completely missed the horror. The system that created space marines, that enhanced human bodies past normal limitations and filled their minds with propaganda disguised as faith, had designed the perfect trap. We were given abilities that ensured we'd survive longer than mercy would permit, then placed in situations where that survival became worse than death. And when we finally died, they harvested our gene seed and used it to create new Marines who would suffer the same fates. An eternal cycle of engineered suffering, self-perpetuating across millennia. The Emperor, if he was even truly conscious anymore, locked in that throne room on Terra, had created this system deliberately. had designed Space Marines to be disposable tools that lasted just long enough to be useful before degradation set in. We were never sons, never brothers in any meaningful sense. We were manufactured products, genetic constructs built to serve functions and then discarded when those functions were complete. And the cruelest part was the conditioning. The hypno-indoctrination that made us believe we served something divine rather than recognizing we were slaves to bureaucratic systems that had been grinding humans into components for 10,000 years. Every prayer we'd been taught was a control mechanism. Every liturgy was programming. Every moment of faith was delusion installed by those who benefited from our belief in lies. The genestealers on the Testament of Ruin were honest in their predation. They killed to survive and breed, with no pretense of divine mandate or higher purpose. The Imperium was worse because it dressed its consumption of humanity in the language of sanctity and told its victims they were blessed to be devoured. I'd spent 200 years learning these truths through direct experience, and the knowledge had died with me, scrubbed away to maintain the propaganda that kept new generations willing to serve. This is what the Imperium does. It consumes humans, their labor, their faith, their lives, their children, and calls it glorious. It takes everything people have to give and demands they be grateful for the privilege of being ground into paste. Space Marines were just the most visible example. Enhanced to be impressive, their suffering hidden behind propaganda about duty and honor. But the same system operated at every level. Hive workers dying in manufactorums, Imperial Guard thrown at enemies in waves, entire planets reduced to radioactive ash in wars whose purposes were lost millennia ago. All of it justified by lies about divine protection and sacred duty. All of it perpetuating because those who suffered were conditioned to believe their suffering had meaning. And when they discovered the truth, when the conditioning broke and they saw the system for what it actually was, it was too late. They were already consumed, already integrated into the machine, their deaths serving only to fuel the next cycle. This is the Imperium of man. Not glorious, not sacred, just a vast machine that eats humans and calls it holy. And I helped perpetuate it for 247 years, believing I served something divine when I was only serving tyrants who'd successfully convinced their slaves that slavery was freedom. My name was Davos Sanctori. I remember that now, in whatever form consciousness takes after the body dies. I remember my father's hands in red dust. Remember learning to read wind patterns and track sandworms. Remember believing I'd been honored when the blood angels took me from my family and transformed me into something that was no longer wholly human. I remember 47 years of life before the fall. Remember 35 years as a space marine, believing every lie they'd programmed into me. Remember thinking the Emperor protects was truth rather than propaganda. I remember 200 years in the Testament of Ruin's darkness, slowly understanding that everything I'd been taught was false, that the protection was a lie, that the purpose was slavery, that the enhanced lifespan they called a gift was actually the cruelest punishment, existence beyond the point where death would have been mercy. I remember the Ultramarines finding me, treating me like a specimen rather than a brother. Remember Mephiston ripping through my memories and walking away horrified. Remember dying finally, 247 years after I should have been permitted to die, my gene seed harvested to create new Marines who would suffer the same fates. And I remember the truth they'll never acknowledge, that Space Marines aren't heroes. We're victims of a system that enhances humans past normal limitations, specifically so we'll survive long enough to suffer more before we're finally allowed to die. The gene seed they harvested from my body is being implanted in new scouts right now. Young men who believe they're being elevated to sacred service, not understanding they're being conditioned into tools that will be used until they break and then discarded. One of them might be deployed to a space hulk someday, might fall through corroded deck plating, might survive long enough to understand what he's actually been created for, and if he does, he'll discover the same truth I did. That the Emperor doesn't protect, that machine spirits aren't real, that chaos gods are just warp parasites wearing religious camouflage, that every prayer is unanswered propaganda, that faith is conditioning designed to make slaves willing. He'll discover that the Imperium grinds its own citizens into components with the same efficiency it grinds Xenos into extinction. That loyalty is rewarded with suffering more often than salvation. That service leads only to death or worse than death, and he'll scream warnings that no one will hear because the system has survived for 10,000 years by ensuring the truth dies with those who learn it. This is what I learned in 200 years of abandonment and horror, that humanity created its own hell and called it the Imperium, that we worship a corpse tyrant who created systems specifically designed to consume us, that we've been convinced our consumption is sacred duty, rather than recognizing it as the atrocity it actually is. The Testament of Ruin was a perfect metaphor. 12 kilometers of compressed wreckage, ships and crews merged together through forces that cared nothing for their original purposes, creating a structure that existed only to consume anything that entered it. That's the Imperium. 12,000 worlds compressed and merged through 10 millennia of warfare and propaganda, creating a structure that exists only to consume humanity while convincing them their consumption is glorious. I was lost in that structure for 200 years, and I'm still lost, my consciousness somehow persisting in forms I don't understand, merged with something larger that might be the warp or might be something else entirely. I watch new scouts train, watch them believe the same lies I believed. Watch them march toward fates they don't understand, while authorities who know better send them anyway. And I can't warn them, can't scream the truth, can't do anything except watch the cycle continue, generation after generation, the Imperium grinding humans into components and calling it the Emperor's will. My name was Davos Sanctori. I was a Blood Angel scout sergeant. I fell into darkness and lived there for 200 years, and the darkness taught me the only truth that matters, that faith in false gods is worse than no faith at all, and that service to systems that consume you is slavery regardless of how many prayers you dress it in. I died believing nothing, hoping for nothing, knowing only that the suffering was eternal and the lies would outlive everyone who learned the truth. This is the Imperium of man. This is what they don't tell you when they take your children and promise they'll become heroes. This is the horror. And somewhere in the Testament of Ruin, in sub-level 93, in a ventilation shaft that shouldn't be large enough for space marine physiology, there's still a presence, still something that remembers being human, still something that walks an endless circuit through darkness, hunting gynastelas and being slowly consumed by the Hulk's merging process. Still something that wants to warn you. Don't believe them when they tell you the Emperor protects. He doesn't. He never did. And if you serve long enough to learn that truth, you'll spend eternity wishing you died before you understood. My name was Davos Sanctori, and I'm still there, in the dark, walking the circuit. Forever.